that we learned as children and were part of our lives, and which we assumed were the real history of the Jews. And this morning we're going to confront the evidence of science through two incredible people, Israel Finkelstein and Amichai Mazar. And so let me just remind you of the schedule again for this morning. Part one, which is now, we're going to focus on the familiar stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. We're going to turn to the Exodus and the story of Moses, who was the central figure and is the central figure of traditional Judaism. How true are those stories? And the Conquest by Joshua of Canaan. So first, Professor Finkelstein will make the major presentation, and then Professor Mazar will respond to him. And then you've noticed the panel is up there. And they were good listeners last night, but after the two have made their presentation, they'll have questions, all right? And if the purpose of the panel is also to make sure that you fully understand, what is going on. So without further ado, and I'm all excited to listen to it, I want to introduce again Professor Israel Finkelstein.
Let me first of all try to manage with the computer here. Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom. Patriarchs, Exodus, Conquest, I called it, facts or fiction. This lecture deals with the formative periods in the history of biblical Israel, and as such is at the same time easier and more complicated. Easier because most of us agree that the biblical description of this era in the history of ancient Israel does not deal with actual events in the second millennium BC. More complicated because much of the evidence is negative and therefore difficult to present. In addition, we are dealing with two different sources, which many scholars understood as representing different phases in the authorship process. The story of the Patriarchs and Exodus is told in the Pentateuch, or the Torah, while the story of the Conquest is narrated in the book of Joshua, which is part of the Deuteronomistic history. The sources in the Pentateuch, which has most of the historical quote-unquote material in Genesis, the J source, was traditionally dated to the 10th century BC, while it is clear that the Deuteronomistic history was put in writing much later. Yet, in recent years, this view has been gradually changed, mainly as a result of German research. Today, many scholars identify strong relationship between the J source and the Deuteronomistic history, and I would strongly argue that both reflect the monarchic realities, late monarchic realities. Both put late monarchic Judah in the center of the story and serve its ideological and theological goals. Genesis and Exodus also portray later Persian period concerns. In order to overcome this difficulty, I will first discuss at length the story of the Patriarchs as a case study for the historical, again, quote-unquote, part in the Pentateuch. And at the end of this presentation, I will briefly deal with the Exodus and Conquest narratives. So let's start with the Patriarchs. The story of the Patriarchs, how a family grows into a nation, is the first great saga of the Bible. The biblical account of the life of the Patriarchs is in some ways a typical family story, with all its joy and sadness, love and hatred, deceit and cunning, famine and prosperity. But it is also a universal philosophical story about devotion and obedience, faith and pity. From almost every standpoint, historical, psychological, spiritual, the patriarch narratives are powerful literary achievements, but are they reliable annals of the birth of the people of Israel? That's the question. I will start with the failed search for the historical Abraham. Many of the early biblical archaeologists had been trained as theologians. They were persuaded by their faith that God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as both the birthright of the Jewish people and as the birthright passed on to Christians, as the Apostle Paul explained in his letters to the Galatians, was real. And if it was real, it was presumably given to real people. The French biblical scholar and archaeologist Roland Devaux noted that, and I quote, "If the historical faith of Israel is not founded in history, such faith is erroneous, and therefore our faith is also." And the doyen of American biblical archaeology, William Foxwell Albright, echoed this sentiment, insisting that, and I quote again, "As a whole, the picture in Genesis is historical, and there is no reason to doubt the general accuracy of the biographical details." Indeed, from the early decades of the 20th century, with the great discoveries in Mesopotamia and the intensification of archaeological activity in Palestine, many biblical historians and archaeologists were convinced that new discoveries could prove that the patriarchs were historical figures. They argued that the biblical narratives, even if compiled at a relatively late date, such as the period of the United Monarchy of Solomon, preserved at least the main outline of an authentic ancient historical reality. Albright argued that certain details, such as personal names and land purchase laws in the stories in Genesis, may be found in the records of second millennium BC Mesopotamian societies from which the patriarchs ostensibly originated. No less important, the patriarchs are described as conducting a Bedouin way of life, moving with their flocks throughout the hill country of Canaan. All these elements convinced Albright that the age of the patriarchs was a real one. He thus began to search for evidence for the presence of pastoral groups of Mesopotamian origin in Canaan around 2000 BC, a date which seemed to fit the biblical chronology of the patriarchs. The Amorite hypothesis, so it was called. Well, the Amorite hypothesis was the most influential of all attempts to locate the patriarchs on historical and archaeological grounds. Canaan of the 3rd millennium BC, the early Bronze Age, was characterized by full-blown urban life. Large cities developed in the lowlands. They were surrounded by formidable fortifications and accommodated palaces and temples. Then, in the late 3rd millennium BC, this flourishing urban system collapsed. The cities were destroyed or abandoned, and many of them never recovered from the shock. In addition, many of the rural settlements around them were abandoned. What followed was a period of a few centuries of a very different culture, with no big cities, when most of the population, at least as believed by archaeologists in the 1950s and 1960s, was practicing a pastoral nomadic mode of subsistence before urban life gradually recovered and Canaan entered a second urban period, that of the Middle Bronze Age, in the early 2nd millennium BC. Albright put the spotlight on the period between the two urban phases. He and other scholars of the time argued that the collapse of the early Bronze urban culture was sudden, and that it was the outcome of an invasion of pastoral nomads from the fringe of the desert in the northeast. He identified the invaders with the Amorites of the Mesopotamian texts. Albright and his followers went one step further and dated the Abraham episode in the Genesis stories to this phase in the history of Canaan. Albright suggested that Abraham, and I quote, a caravaneer of high repute, unquote, took part in the great trade network of the 19th century BC. Texts of that time found near the city of Kayseri in central Turkey attest to the prosperous trade relation between Mesopotamia and North Syria, thus paralleling the Ur-Haran movement of Abraham in Genesis 11, from Ur to Haran. And a contemporary tomb painting from Egypt provides evidence for caravan trade between Transjordan and Egypt, as described in the Joseph story in Genesis. In both cases, donkeys were used as the beast of burden. The American archaeologist Nelson Glick supplied apparent substantiation for this theory. His surveys in Transjordan and the Negev desert revealed hundreds of late third millennium sites, which for Albright gave the background for the stories about Abraham's activity in the south. Yet the Amorite hypothesis did not last long. With additional excavations, most scholars came to the conclusion that the early bronze urban system did not collapse overnight, but declined gradually over many decades, due more to local economic and social upheavals within Canaan than to a wave of outside invaders. In addition, it became clear that the term Amorite was not restricted to pastoral people. Village communities in northern Syria in the early second millennium were also termed Amorite. The theorized similarity in the pastoral way of life in the next phase in the history of the country to the descriptions of Abraham's nomadic lifestyle also changed dramatically. It is now clear that the late third millennium was not a completely nomadic period. True, there were no large cities at the time, and the ratio of the pastoral nomads to the general population grew significantly, but much of the population remained sedentary, living in villages and hamlets. Furthermore, in sharp contradiction to the theory of a great migration of nomads from the north, the continuity of architecture, pottery style, and settlement patterns suggests that the population of Canaan in this inter-urban phase was predominantly indigenous. And the same people would re-establish urban life in Canaan in the cities of the Middle Bronze Age. In short, the ups and downs in Canaan, from urban life to collapse into a more rural pastoral society and back to a second urban phase, are not understood today as reflecting mass migrations and changing populations, but rather as parts in the ages-long cycles of urban growth, collapse, and regrowth of the same indigenous population of Canaan. Now let me jump here over one picture. Another theory proposed to identify the age of the patriarchs in the Middle Bronze, the peak of urban life in the first half of the second millennium BC. Scholars advocating this view, such as Roland Devaux, argued that the nature of the Middle Bronze Age, as emerged from both text and archaeology, better fits the biblical description, mainly because the patriarchs are depicted as living in tents next to cities. Archaeologically, all the major cities mentioned in Genesis, Shechem, well, I have a nice picture here of Shechem that I can show. Voila. Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, and Gerar were fortified strongholds in the Middle Bronze Age. Textually, this tent-city relationship is strongly attested in the archive found in the ruins of the famous early second millennium city of Mari on the Euphrates in Syria. In addition, the supporters of a Middle Bronze date for the Patriarchs period argued that the personal names of the Patriarchs resemble names known from the early second millennium BC. The American scholars Cyrus Gordon and Ephraim Spicer refer to similarities between social and legal practices in the biblical description of the patriarchal period and social and legal practices in second millennium Near Eastern texts. The most important of these texts are the Nuzi tablets from northern Iraq, which date to the 15th century BC. To cite a few examples, in Nuzi, a barren wife is required to provide a slave woman for her husband to bear his children, a clear parallel to the biblical story on Sarai and Hagar in Genesis 16. At Nuzi, slaves were adopted by childless couples, similar to the adoption of Eliezer by Abraham, as is here Genesis 15. But soon the Middle Bronze Nuzi solution also disintegrated. From the point of view of archaeology, the difficulty came mainly from what we do not see in the biblical text. The Middle Bronze Age was a period of advanced urban life. Canaan was dominated by a group of powerful city-states ruled from such capitals as Hatzor, Megiddo. These cities were strongly fortified by huge earthen ramparts with massive gates. They had great palaces and towering temples. But in the biblical text, we do not see this at all. True, a few cities are mentioned, but not necessarily the most important ones. Shechem, as a city, is not there, and so is Jerusalem. Both were massive Middle Bronze strongholds, and in the plains, we should have heard about Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, not Gerar. To cut a long story short, the biblical story of the Patriarchs is not the story of Middle Bronze Age Canaan. And the phenomenon of nomads living near city dwellers was not restricted to the Middle Bronze Age. It was there before and continued at least until quite late in the first millennium BC. And as for the names of the patriarchs, they were common in later periods as well, in the Late Bronze and the Iron Age. As for the Nuzi texts, later studies have proven that the social and legal practices which show similarities to the biblical narratives cannot be restricted to a single period. They were common in the ancient Near East throughout the second and first millennia BC. For instance, the responsibility of a barren wife to provide her husband with a servant to bear him children appears in later periods, such as 7th century marriage contract from Assyria. And just when a second millennium solution seemed to be a lost case, the Israeli biblical scholar Benjamin Mazar poured archaeological data into the late 9th century idea of Julius Wellhausen, that the description of the age of the patriarchs should be studied on the background of the period of the monarchy. He, Mazar, pointed out mainly to the anachronisms in the text, such as the mention of the Philistines and the Arameans. Needless to say, there were no Philistines in Canaan in the Middle Bronze Age. Both Egyptian texts and archaeology proved beyond doubt that they settled on the southern coast of Palestine in the 12th century BC. Instead of seeing their appearance here, in the text that is, as a late insertion in the time of the compilation of the text into an earlier tradition, Benjamin Mazar argued that the text reflects an intimate knowledge of the Philistine kingdoms in a period prior to the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. The Arameans figure prominently in the patriarchal stories, but they too did not appear on the ancient Near Eastern stage before the early Iron Age, and their early states emerged even later, mainly in the 9th century. Mazar thought that the description of the Arameans as pastoral people reflects an early phase in their history, before they organized their first states. Benjamin Mazar, was at the same time right and wrong. He was right in his claim that the reality behind the stories of the book of Genesis should be tracked along the situation in the Iron Age. He was wrong because he opted for a too early date in the Iron Age. More about this later. The anachronisms. The German biblical scholar Julius Wellhausen argued over a century ago that the stories of the patriarchs reflected the concerns of the later Israelite monarchy, which were projected onto the lives of legendary fathers in a mythical past. In more recent decades, the American biblical scholars John Van Seters and Thomas Thompson stated that even if the later text contained some early traditions, the selection and arrangement of stories expressed a clear message by the biblical editors at the time of compilation, rather than preserving a reliable historical account. But when did that compilation take place? The biblical text provides some clear clues. First, the stories of the patriarchs are packed with camels, usually herds of camels, but as in the story of Joseph's sale by his brothers into slavery, camels are also described as beasts of burden, used in caravan trade. We now know that camels were not domesticated as beasts of burden earlier than the late second millennium, and were not widely used in that capacity in the ancient Near East until well after 1000 BC. And the story of a caravan of camels carrying, and I quote, gum, balm, and myrrh, unquote, in the Joseph story, reveals an obvious familiarity with the main products of the lucrative Arabian trade that flourished under Assyrian domination in the 8th and 7th centuries. Indeed, the excavations at the site of Tel Jeme in the southern coastal plain of Israel, an important trade entrepot on the main caravan route between Arabia and the Mediterranean, revealed a dramatic increase in the number of camel bones in the 7th century. Many scholars, particularly those who supported the idea of the historical patriarchs, consider these details to be incidental insertions into an earlier composition. But as Thomas Thompson put it as early as the 1970s, the specific references in the text to cities, neighboring people, and familiar places are precisely those aspects that distinguish the patriarchal stories from completely mythical folktales. They are crucially important for identifying the date and message of the text. Judah and its neighbors. The patriarchal stories offer the colorful human map of the ancient Near East from the unmistakable viewpoint of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Let me start with the Arameans, who dominate the Jacob stories. The Arameans became an important factor on the northern borders of the Israelites in the early 9th century, when a number of their kingdoms emerged in the area of modern Syria. Among them, Aram Damascus was a sometime ally, sometime rival with the Kingdom of Israel for control of the rich agricultural territories that lay between their main centers. The cycle of stories about Jacob and Laban metaphorically expressed the complex and often stormy relations between Israel and Aram. On the one hand, they were frequent military rivals. On the other hand, much of the population of the northern territories of the Kingdom of Israel seems to have been Aramean in origin. Indeed, the stories of the relations between the individual patriarchs and their Aramean cousins clearly express the consciousness of shared origins. But the biblical description of the tensions between Jacob and Laban and their eventual establishment of a boundary stone east of the Jordan to mark the border between their people, Genesis 31, significantly an E, or a northern story, reflects the territorial partition between Aram and Israel in the 9th, 8th centuries BC. The relationships of Israel and Judah with their eastern neighbors are also reflected in the patriarchal narratives. Through the 8th and 7th century BC, the relations between Israel and Judah and the kingdoms of Ammon and Moab had often been hostile. It is therefore highly significant and amusing how the neighbors to the east are marked in the patriarchal stories. Genesis 19, significantly a southern text, informs us that those nations were born from an incestuous union of the two daughters of Lot with their father. The biblical stories of the two brothers, Jacob and Esau, provide a clear case of 7th century perceptions presented in ancient costume. The description of the two brothers, the fathers of Edom and Israel, serves as a divine legitimacy for the political relationship between the two nations in late monarchic times. Jacob, Israel, is sensitive and cultured, while Esau, Edom, is a more primitive hunter and man of the outdoor. But Edom did not exist as a distinct political entity until a relatively late period. From the Assyrian sources, we know that Edom emerged as a real state only in the late 8th century and became a serious rival to Judah only with the beginning of the lucrative Arabian trade under Assyrian domination. The archaeological evidence is clear. The first large-scale wave of settlement in Edom, accompanied by the establishment of large settlements and fortresses, may have started in the late 8th century, but reached the peak only in the 7th and early 6th centuries BC. Before then, the area was sparsely populated. Excavations at Bozrah, the capital of late Iron II Edom, revealed that it grew to become a large city only in the Assyrian period. Place names mentioned in the patriarchal narratives relating to the surrounding wilderness further confirm the date of the composition. Genesis 14, the story of the war waged by invaders from the north with the kings of the cities of the plain, is a unique source, which may also be dated to exilic or even post-exilic times, but it provides interesting geographical information relevant only to the 7th century. It mentions a place named Ein Mishpat, that is Kadesh. And this place is most likely a reference to Kadesh Barnea, the great oasis in the south, safely identified with Ein al-Kuderat in the eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, a site that has been excavated and shown to have been occupied primarily in the 7th and early 6th centuries. Likewise, the site referred to as, in the same story, as Tamar, in the same biblical verse, should be identified with Ein Hatzeva, south of the Dead Sea, where excavations have uncovered a large fortress which also functioned in the late Iron Age. Therefore, the geography and even the basic situation of a frightening conflict with a Mesopotamian invader would have seemed ominously familiar to the people of Judah in the 7th century. Judah's destiny. The German... What have I done wrong here? This always happens. Okay, we'll see. Okay, let's hope for the best. The German biblical scholar Martin Knott theorized that originally the patriarchal stories were separate regional traditions that were assembled into a unified narrative to serve the cause of political unification of a heterogeneous Israelite population. In his opinion, the geographical focus of each of the patriarchal stories offered an important clue to where each of the traditions came from. Many of the stories connected with Abraham are set in the southern part of the hill country, specifically the region of Hebron. Isaac is associated with the southern desert fringe of Judah, in particular the Beersheba region. In contrast, Jacob's activities take place for the most part in the northern hill country and Transjordan, areas that were part of the northern kingdom of Israel. Not therefore suggested that the patriarchs were originally separate regional ancestors who were eventually brought together in a single genealogy in an effort to create a unified history. Indeed, it is evident that the selection of Abraham with his close connections to Hebron, Judah's earliest royal city, and to Jerusalem, Salem in Genesis 14, was meant to emphasize the primacy of Judah even in the earliest eras of Israelite history. Until the late 8th century, Judah was a rather isolated and sparsely populated kingdom. It was hardly comparable in territory, wealth, and military might to the kingdom of Israel in the north. Literacy was very limited, and the capital, Jerusalem, was a small, remote hill country town. Yet, after the northern kingdom of Israel was liquidated by the Assyrian Empire in 720 BC, Judah grew enormously in population, developed complex state institutions, and emerged as a meaningful power in the region. Hence, from the late 8th century and in the 7th century, Judah developed a unique sense of its own importance and divine destiny. It saw its very survival as evidence of God's intentions from the time of the patriarchs that Judah should rule over the land of Israel. What was needed was a powerful way to express this understanding, both to the people of Judah and to the scattered Israelite communities under Assyrian rule. So even though the Genesis stories revolve around Judah, they do not neglect to honor northern Israelite traditions. In that respect, it is significant that Abraham builds altars to the God of Israel at Shechem and Bethel in Genesis 12, the two most important cult centers of the northern kingdom, as well as at Hebron in Genesis 13, the most important center of Judah after Jerusalem. The figure of Abraham, therefore, functions as a unifier of southern and northern traditions, as bridging north and south. The patriarchal traditions, therefore, must be considered as a sort of a pious prehistory of Israel in which Judah played a decisive role. They describe the very early history of the nation, delineate ethnic boundaries, embrace the traditions of north and south, and in the end emphasize the superiority of Judah from the early beginnings. But the compilation of Genesis did not end in the 7th century BC. There can be no doubt that it continued in the Persian period until at least the 5th century BC. Scholars have long noted, which means after the destruction and the return, scholars have long noted that the priestly source in the Pentateuch is in the main post-exilic in date, which means late. It is related to the rise of the priests to prominence in the temple community in Jerusalem, that is, with no kings anymore. The final redaction of the Pentateuch dates to this period. The biblical scholar Richard Friedman went one step farther and suggested that the redactor, the one who gave the final shape to the 5 books of Moses, was Ezra, who is specifically described as, and I quote, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, unquote, in Ezra chapter 7. The post-exilic writers needed to reunite the community of Yehud around the temple, that is again after the destruction, to give the people hope for a better future, to address the problem of the relationship with the neighboring groups, especially in the north and south, and to deal with questions related to domestic problems in the community. In those aspects, many of the needs of the post-exilic Yehud community were quite similar to the necessities of the late monarchic Judahite state. Both late monarchic Judah and Persian Yehud, well, both, where am I? Both were small communities. Both were small communities inhabiting a limited territory and acknowledging the fact that they dominate only a small part of the promised land, but sensing great importance as the only territorial center of the Israelite nation. Both were surrounded by alien, hostile neighbors. Both claimed nearby territories which were outside their realm, and both faced problems with foreigners from within and without. Hence, much of the ideology of Judah in late monarchic period was not alien to the ears of the people of Jerusalem in post-exilic times. The idea of the centrality of Judah and its superiority on its neighbors certainly rang a bell in the consciousness of the people of the late 6th and 5th centuries BC. But at the same time, other circumstances, such as the decline of the House of David and the new territorial issues or problems, forced the early post-exilic writers to reshape the old ideas in order to fit them to the new realities and the new needs. The tradition of the tombs of the patriarchs in Hebron, which is a priestly story, should also be understood, or even give an example, on this background. In post-exilic times, the southern border of Yehud ran between the towns of Bet Sur and Hebron. Remembering the importance of Hebron in the time of the monarchy, the people of Yehud must have mourned the fact that in their own days it did not belong to them. A tradition placing the tombs of the patriarchs, the founders of the nation, at Hebron would serve their goal of fixing a strong attachment to the southern hill country. No less important, the latest editors of Genesis were eager to show how the origins of the people of Israel lay at the very heart of the civilized world. Thus, unlike the lesser people around them, they boasted that the great father of the people of Israel came from the cosmopolitan, famed city of Ur. Not only was Ur renowned as a place of extreme antiquity and learning, it gained great prestige throughout the ancient Near East during the period of its re-establishment as a religious center by the Babylonian or Chaldean king Nebuchadnezzar. Thus, therefore, the reference to Abraham's origin in, and I quote, Ur of the Chaldeans, unquote, would have offered the Jewish people a distinguished and ancient cultural pedigree. Exodus. As I told you before, I will go over Exodus and Conquest stories briefly, just to demonstrate that the same rules that I have described can be applied to these narratives as well. This treatment of the patriarchal stories can serve as a model for the reading of Exodus. In this case, too, the attempts to locate the events in the 13th century BC in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties. There is no mention of such an event in any New Kingdom source. There is no trace of the early Hebrews in Egypt. The northern coast of Sinai was protected by formidable Egyptian forts, which could have easily prevented an escaping people from crossing the desert. There is no trace of late bronze remains in the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, not even in a place like Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are supposed to have camped for a long time. And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptians, 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area according to the Amarna letters. Finally, many of the places mentioned in the story of Exodus and the wandering in the desert were not inhabited before the 8th or even 7th centuries BC. Indeed, the Egyptologist Donald Redford convincingly showed that both the geography of Exodus in the Eastern Delta and the personal names in the story best fit the site period in the history of Egypt in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. That is close to the time of the compilation of the biblical text. A late date compilation would also fit most of the place names mentioned in regard to the wandering in the desert. At the same time, Redford did not discard the possibility that Exodus preserves an ancient memory of great events which took place centuries earlier, possibly the expulsion of Canaanite population from the delta of the Nile in the 16th century BC. Is it possible that the story of great confrontation between the Israelites and an Egyptian pharaoh was used to send a strong message to the Judahites of late monarchic times? And a bit later also, in the late 7th century BC, with the withdrawal of Assyria from the Levant, two great revival programs collided. Judah's dream under King Josiah of reconquering the lost territories of the ex-Northern Kingdom and reactivating the golden age of reactivating, in quotation marks, the golden age of King David, and Egypt's plan under the Said dynasty, mainly King Psammetichus I, of reviving their great empire in the Levant. Is it possible that an old story of how a great pharaoh was humiliated and defeated by the God of Israel was used in order to send a message of hope to the people of Judah in the time of the authors? There is no doubt that the Exodus story also had a strong, possible stronger, even stronger impact in exilic and post-exilic times, which means not only in the time of Josiah in the late 7th century, but even later, after the destruction. To put it in the words of the biblical scholar David Kleins, and I quote, "The bondage in Egypt is their own bondage in Babylon, and the Exodus past becomes the Exodus that is yet to be." And later on, the similarity between the story of the Exodus from Egypt and the memories of the return from exile influenced each other in a reciprocal way. Reading the Exodus, the returnees from Babylon to Judah found a mirror to their own plight. According to the biblical scholar Yair Hoffman, both stories tell us how the Israelites left their land from a foreign country, how after a rough period in exile, the Hebrews, or Judahites if you wish, came back to their homeland, how on the way back the returnees had to cross a dangerous desert, how the return to the homeland evoked conflicts with the local population, how the returnees managed to settle only part of their promised homeland, and how measures were taken by the leaders of the returnees to avoid assimilation between the Israelites and the population of the land. The Conquest. A series of excavations carried out from the late 1920s through the 1950s revealed data which were conceived as supporting the biblical narrative of the conquest of Canaan. At many sites the late Bronze II cities were destroyed in a big conflagration, which were dated, those destructions, to the late 13th century BC and associated with the invading Israelites. This date was fixed according to the conventional chronology of Aegean pottery sequence, but this in turn was influenced by the conquest story in the Bible, again some sort of a circular reasoning. From the outset, this paradigm, advanced by Albright and later Yigael Yadin, faced strong opposition from German biblical scholars, who proposed a completely different paradigm for the rise of early Israel. And the progress in archaeological and anthropological research between the 1960s and the 1980s brought about the total demise of the military conquest theory. First, excavations at key sites mentioned in the conquest narrative in the Bible, such as Jericho, Ai, and Arad, showed that they were not inhabited in the late Bronze Age, or were insignificant villages. Second, new finds at Lachish and Afek, and re-evaluation of finds from the older digs at Megiddo and Chatzor indicated that the collapse of the late Bronze Canaanite city-state system was a long process which took at least several decades, thereby not allowing a theory about a unified conquest by one general and one army. Third, historical and archaeological studies have shown the strength of the Egyptian grip on Canaan until the second half of the 12th century. Egypt could have easily prevented an invasion of Canaan by a ragtag army. Fourth, it has become clear that the collapse of late Bronze Canaan was part of a wider phenomenon which encompassed the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Fifth, the large-scale surveys which were conducted in the Central Hill Country in the 1980s indicated that the rise of ancient Israel was a phase in long-term cyclic processes of sedentarization and nomadization of local people, of autochthonous groups. We'll speak about it later today. On the other hand, it is inconceivable that the conquest stories were invented by late monarchic writers. The Deuteronomistic historian must have taken old folk tales and fragmented memories and incorporated them in his compilation. Some of these could have been ideological legends connected with specific locales, such as the huge pile of stones at Ai, while others could have preserved vague memories of the collapse of the old world at the end of the Bronze Age. But the overall outline of the conquest narrative reflects late monarchic realities. Central to the Deuteronomistic thinking was the idea that all Israelite territories and people should be ruled by a Davidic king, and that all Israelite cult should be centralized in the temple in Jerusalem. This ideology probably emerged after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, but could not have been fulfilled as long as Assyria dominated the region. But when the Assyrians pulled out around 630 BC, it seemed possible to accomplish. Thus, at a time when possession of the land was of great concern, the book of Joshua offered an unforgettable epic with a clear lesson, creating a vivid, unified narrative of how, when the people of Israel did follow the covenant with their God to the letter, no victory could be denied to them. That point was narrated against a highly familiar 7th century background and played in places of the greatest concerns to the Deuteronomistic ideology. So, as noted by Richard Nelson, the towering figure of Joshua is used to paint a metaphorical portrait of Josiah, the would-be savior of all the people of Israel. Josiah is the new Joshua, and the past mythical conquest of Canaan is a battle plan for the present fight and the conquest to be. The first two battles at Jericho and Ai, that is the area of Bethel, were pitched in territories which were the first target of Josianic expansionism after the withdrawal. Josianic is under the King Josiah. Okay? Expansionism and after the withdrawal of Assyria. Likewise, the story on the Gibeonites, who have, and I quote, come from a far country, unquote, and asked to make a covenant with the invading Israelites has a basis in the historical reality of the 7th century, because expanding northward into the area of Bethel, Judah faced a problem of how to integrate the descendants of the deportees brought by the Assyrians from afar and settled there a few decades earlier. The probably old story of the Gibeonites could provide an historical context in which the Deuteronomist historian explained how it was possible to integrate these people, though they were not Israelite by origin. Next come the conquest of the Shephelah, probably symbolizing the renewed Judahite expansion into this important fertile region, expansion which is evident from the distribution of late monarchic finds, archaeological finds. This area, the traditional breadbasket of the southern kingdom, had been seized from Judah by Sennacherib, king of Assyria, a few decades earlier, and given to the cities of the coastal plain, but seems to have been reincorporated into the territory of Judah in the course of the 7th century. Finally, the biblical story turns to the north, and this time the conquest of the past becomes a utopic conquest in the future. The reference to Hatzor calls to mind not only its reputation in the distant past as the most prominent of the Canaanite city-states, but certainly the realities of more recent times, when it was the most important center of the Kingdom of Israel in the north. And the territories described in relation to the war in the north perfectly match the Galilee territories of the vanquished northern kingdom of Israel. These were the territories which were conceived in 7th century Judah as lawfully and divinely belonging to the Davidic kings in Jerusalem. To sum up, the Patriarchs, Exodus, and Conquest narratives, which describe the formative history of the people of Israel, cannot be read as a straightforward historical account. It is conceivable that many of the stories preserve old memories, folk tales, myths, and theological anecdotes. But in the way they are portrayed in the Bible, they are wrapped in late monarchic, and in the case of the Patriarchs and Exodus, also post-exilic realities. Moreover, the way in which they were compiled discloses that they serve the ideological aims of the authors. These stories should not be read, therefore, in a sequential order from early to late. Rather, as I mentioned yesterday, they must be understood from late to early, from the perspective of the period when they were put in writing. Thank you.